Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm Carrie Enright Cato, Director of the Office of Climate Change, Technology, and Research at Connecticut DEEP. Welcome to Exploring Climate Solutions webinar series. This series is brought to you by the Governor's Council on Climate Change. On April 22nd, 2015, Governor Malloy issued an executive order creating the Governor's Council on Climate Change, also known as the GC3. The Council is charged with examining the efficacy of existing policies and regulations designed to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and identify new strategies to meet the state's greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. The Council is composed of 15 members from state agencies, quasi-state agencies, businesses, and nonprofits. To learn more about the GC3, please go to www.ct.gov/deep/GC3. The webinar series explores innovative and successful climate change solutions in Connecticut and the nation. This series provides firsthand accounts of high-profile municipal climate programs, climate initiatives in the corporate world, new greenhouse gas reporting frameworks, statewide sustainability programs, low-carbon fuel initiatives, and other programs and projects that help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve climate resilience. Today, we're excited to have Mary Sotos, Deputy Commissioner of Energy. Mary will be providing an overview of Connecticut's recently released 2018 Comprehensive Energy Strategy. By statute, DEEP is required to periodically update the CES for all energy needs in the state, including but not limited to electricity, heating, cooling, and transportation. The 2018 CES recommends policies that support the state's broader environmental policies to meet clean air, clean water, land conservation and development, and waste reduction goals, including reducing GHG emissions 10% below 1990 levels by 2020 and 80% below 2001 levels by 2050. Also on hand for today's webinar is Lauren Savage, Director of the Office of Supply, Diane Duva, Director of the Office of Demand, Julia Dumaine, and Eric Annis, both research analysts here at DEEP. So we typically take questions at the end of the full presentation, but today we'll present on each sector covered in the CES and answer a few questions in between each sector. We'll start with the building sector, move on to the electric sector, and end with the transportation sector. If you have questions, please submit them in the dialog box, and we'll read them aloud for everyone here in the room to respond to. Before we get started, for those of you listening via your computer speakers, and if you're experiencing poor sound quality, I do encourage you to call in using your telephone. With that, let's go ahead and get started. I turn it over to Mary.
Great, thank you, Carrie. We are pleased to be announcing that we have our comprehensive energy strategy out. And I think it's important to see this document as part of the larger legacy of energy and climate leadership in the state. Over the last 2 years, we have procured over 800 megawatts of renewable energy and energy efficiency resources. We've also established an award-winning Connecticut Green Bank, first in the nation state microgrid program, which helps build our local resiliency. Our energy efficiency initiatives have won numerous awards nationally. And as Carrie mentioned previously, we also have a Governor's Council on Climate Change that helps provide insight and recommend further targets going forward so that we can keep climate at the forefront. As we think about the legacy that we have here in Connecticut, the progress we've made on climate and energy, we know that a target for our near term is going to be important to help us, again, stay on track for what's already in statute as a climate target for 2050. So the GC3 over the last year has been looking at modeling across a number of sectors for what we call the midterm target for 2030 should be, again, to achieve where we need to be by 2050. The Council came to a consensus recommendation that our interim target should be 45% emission reductions below 2001 levels. So you'll see that recommended target in some of the legislative proposals that actually have a hearing later today and will be further discussed in the coming weeks. So with a reduction target of 45% by 2030, it's clear there would be some significant changes that would be needed across all sectors to help achieve that goal. And so you'll see once we go into some of the specific strategies on the energy side, how we think those targets by sector could be contributing in the next few years to that trajectory. But it's also, anytime we're talking about climate, we think it's important to focus on the fact that we're already feeling the effects of climate change, from changes in the Long Island Sound fisheries to increases in severe weather events. One of the other proposals that you'll see legislatively this year is a recommendation for the state to use a 50-centimeter sea level rise by 2050 as the metric for state planning. This also intersects closely with energy planning, as well as we have a number of substations along the coast that would be impacted by these projections of sea level rise. So as we think about where's the intersection of climate and energy, it's a very close intersection. Over 90% of Connecticut's GHG emissions are related to energy use. So in this CES, again, we tried to keep a focus on planning, resiliency, and what we can do to be reducing emissions across transportation, home heating, and buildings, as well as the electric grid. So I'm going to give an overview of the 8 key strategies that this CES puts forward. The first 4 relate to clean energy broadly. So our first recommendation is that for the next several years, we need to ensure sustainable and equitable funding for energy efficiency. This is a top priority given that we've seen the funding that we've used for the last several years for energy efficiency was recently impacted by a budgetary decision last session, which diverted much of the funding that we were counting on to achieve efficiency. So going forward, we'll need some additional tools and approaches to make sure we stay on track. We also need to continue to advance market transformation of the energy efficiency industry. We also need to grow and sustain renewable and zero carbon generation in the state and in the region, and expand deployment of all cost-effective distributed generation, which is also termed behind the meter generation, in a sustainable manner. So we'll go through in more detail what each of these recommendations actually means and what some of the specific proposals are to implement them. But then our final 4 CES recommendations relate more broadly to infrastructure. So we should be continuing to improve grid reliability and resiliency through state and regional efforts. And then when we think about transportation, which is not necessarily a typical thing that our agency directly addresses, but is a critical contributor to climate change and will increasingly be intersecting with the grid and the electric sector as we continue to see a push towards electric vehicles. Given the need to reduce transportation greenhouse gas emissions, we should be accelerating the adoption of low and zero emission vehicles and strengthening the alternative fueling infrastructure to support that. But transportation is obviously broader than just vehicles alone. We need to be increasing mobility, connectivity, and accessibility by advancing the smart growth, mixed use, transit-oriented development, and innovative transportation partnerships. Finally, all of these strategies depend on a modern grid. So we are recommending a number of different approaches to advance grid modernization, again, to see the kind of reductions in emissions across all the sectors and to provide for a resilient and reliable grid. So that's an overview of our 8 key CES strategies. I'll now go into a little bit more detail on each one of them. So our first recommendation around ensuring sustainable and equitable funding for energy efficiency. What does that mean? Well, the first thing is around implementing sustainable funding for efficiency. We think there are some additional tools that can provide that funding. One that you'll see in a legislative proposal is actually to expand the procurement authority that DEEP has to run solicitations and select energy efficiency projects throughout the state. We also need to find equitable solutions for oil and propane conservation. In the draft CES, for those who are following that, we made a proposal to impose a conservation charge for oil and propane customers so that they would be equitably contributing to the funds that provide for thermal conservation measures. Right now, those customers contribute on their electric bills to electric measures, but unlike natural gas, homes that are heated by natural gas or electricity, oil and propane homes are currently not contributing based on those fuels to those efficiency funds. While I think a type of charge that we were recommending in the draft is not necessarily what we saw a lot of support gathering for in the final. We do think it's important to continue to shine a light on the importance of finding equitable solutions for that conservation. Without that, we know that the homes that are heated by oil and propane won't be able to receive the same kind of services that they need. We also need to be reducing the energy burden of low-income households. And so we have a couple suggestions in the CES of how we can continue to do that. But in a state like Connecticut that has the highest retail electricity rates in the continental U.S., keeping, again, a close focus on how that impacts low-income households is going to be key for us to achieve our goals. Related to that, many households also, if they're trying to seek out conservation or efficiency measures, actually face health and safety barriers first, which makes implementing those weatherization measures more difficult. So as a first step, we need to be addressing health and safety barriers in order to further unlock the efficiency and create healthier homes. And then finally, as we think about what's going to be essential for ensuring sustainable energy efficiency in the state, we know that this is a key driver for what makes Connecticut businesses competitive. So keeping a focus on catalyzing the competitiveness of Connecticut businesses and improving their energy productivity is what makes those businesses we have in our state an attractive place for investment. And then our other efficiency-related recommendation is to advance market transformation of the energy efficiency industry. So this means integrating efficiency with real estate market forces, making sure that we have a workforce in the state that's able to meet the industry demand. It means standardizing efficiency with energy performance codes, standards, and certifications, continuing to make efficiency more mainstream, and transitioning ultimately to cleaner thermal fuels and technologies. 44% of homes in Connecticut are heated through by fuel oil, which is a high percentage compared to both other states regionally and certainly nationally. From a climate perspective, we need to be transitioning to cleaner thermal fuels, but there are some challenges in terms of the cost effectiveness of other types of renewable thermal technologies today. This needs to be a priority over the next several years to improve that cost effectiveness and find new approaches to helping those homes make that transition. And this is just another chart that illustrates that fact, that in Connecticut, again, fuel oil heating in the 40% range, and compared to the rest of the United States, fuel oil is in around 5%, very small. So I'll pause there perhaps and see if there are any questions related to our efficiency strategies.
Great, thank you, Mary. So yes, if you have questions, please submit them to the dialogue box. We have a couple to start with, and Diane Duva and Julia Domain are on hand to answer them, as well as Mary. You noted efficiency strategies for homes and businesses. Does the CES cover institutions and government agencies as well?
Yes, the answer is absolutely 100%. This comprehensive energy strategy covers all buildings in the state when any references to energy efficiency targets or efforts or priorities are made. So absolutely, all businesses, small and large, all homes, whether they're single family, multifamily, homeowners or rented, and all government agencies, institutions are included in the comprehensive energy strategy.
Great. Another question, does the concept of procuring energy efficiency change the role of the CL&M plan or the Energy Efficiency Board?
That's a really important question, because the whole purpose of the procurement of energy efficiency is really about ensuring we have a sustainable funding source for implementation of the Conservation and Load Management Plan. So it doesn't change the role of the Conservation Load Management Plan or the Energy Efficiency Board, which assists the utilities in developing and implementing the Conservation Load Management Plan. Instead, the procurement is simply one of the funding mechanisms that would be described and pointed to in the Conservation Load Management Plan. So the Conservation Load Management Plan would absolutely still go through its regular development process, and the Energy Efficiency Board would still be involved.
Okay, great. We have another question on air-based heat pumps, advocating for or pushing those and block non-reversible central air. Do you need more clarity on that question?
Yeah, well, that's a pretty specific question. I think one of the things both in the draft and that we took a lot of comment on was the importance of heat pumps of all types in advancing Connecticut's energy goals and moving us towards the electrification of our heating systems in the big picture. So we are prioritizing moving electric resistance heating systems to more sustainable renewable thermal systems, all sorts of heat pumps. And of course, the idea of blocking central air is pretty specific. We certainly would encourage more sustainable heating and cooling systems than many of the current types. So we're happy to continue to talk about that, and the Conservation Load Management Plan has specific strategies as well, and that's where we actually, you know, the practitioners and the implementation of that plan would be reflective of the comprehensive energy strategy and some of these specific suggestions that we've heard.
Okay, one last question.
And I will add one other thing, this is Julia Demain, that we do actually include a discussion about partial building applications of heat pumps in Connecticut and their effectiveness there, and we're going to continue looking at that into the future.
Thanks, Julia. Good job.
And one last question before we move on to the electric sector. How important are the energy efficiency goals in meeting our climate reduction goals? Can we do it without energy efficiency, considering the rate?
Right. We absolutely need energy efficiency in order to meet our goals. The Global Warming Solutions Act goals are very important, and energy efficiency is a fundamental part of achieving those goals.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move on to the next sector. If you still have remaining questions, I don't see any more coming in, but if you do think of one in the midst of the rest of the presentation, feel free to submit them. If we have time, we can answer them at the end.
Great. So moving on to electric sector strategies. Our first one is to grow and sustain renewable and zero carbon generation. So specifically, we think that includes an increase to our renewable portfolio standard to be 40% Class 1 renewables by 2030. The state's currently on a track to hit a 20% goal by 2020. So obviously going from 2020 to 2030 and essentially doubling the rate that we have seen for renewable energy is ambitious, and we think is going to be key, again, to our larger climate portfolio, climate strategy. We also know that using existing procurement authority for regional nuclear and hydropower resources is going to be important as well. The department, both on our policy side and our regulatory side, conducted a study that was required both by executive order and by statute to examine the financial viability of the nuclear resources in the region, as well as their role in contributing to maintaining the low emissions profile that we have for our electric sector. So I would sort of say the CES has some description on how we think that procurement authority would work, but there's more detail through this other proceeding on how the state plans to use that. We should also be continuing to procure grid scale renewables based on the needs determined in our integrated resources plan. And when we go out for grid scale renewables, we know that we should keep a focus on making them cost effective, but also environmentally sustainable. When we think about environmental sustainability, we know land use is often, can often be challenging and siting larger renewables in a place like the Northeast that is more densely populated. So we have some suggestions in the CES about how to optimize siting for renewables and use data and mapping both on the electric distribution system as well as mapping different land types to help earlier in the process identify what are the optimal places for renewables. And then finally, we've signaled this both in past integrated resources plans and in other planning documents that we intend to phase down biomass and landfill gas RECs within our Class 1 part of the RPS. This will help ensure that the Class 1 portion of the RPS continues to be clean and have space for new technologies. And then our second big strategy is focused on how do we ensure that as the costs of renewable energy continue to come down, Connecticut ratepayers and consumers are able to benefit from those lower costs. And in order to do that, we need to have structures in place, compensation structures for renewable energy that are fair, transparent, and give a reasonable reflection of what costs are, and I think this graph illustrates that. So on the left, you have the costs in terms of, this would be cents per kilowatt, I think, kilowatt hour. So on the left, in the blue bars, these are our grid scale procurements over time. So on the far left, this is a procurement we did in 2012. The blue bar on the far right is a procurement we made selections in 2016. So you see that the costs on the grid scale, again, through the powers of competition, we've been able to see costs come down, bids sharpen their pencils, so that we have an average cost of, in the 8–9 cent range for, and this is largely grid scale solar and wind. On the smaller scale, the distributed resources, so this is, you can think about residential solar or commercial industrial solar or fuel cells. The costs on that side, one would expect them to be higher, again, based on the different economies of scale. But because the compensation structure for those resources has been based on net metering or virtual net metering, it's tied to a retail rate. And we know that we have high retail rates here in Connecticut, which means we pay more based on that structure for behind the meter resources. I think most folks may not realize we pay up to 2.5 times as much for those resources as we do compared to grid scale. But for us, this signaled that finding ways to separate the compensation from the retail rate would be critical in order to have a sustainable structure moving forward. So specifically, what that means is increasing access, again, to the distributed resources opportunities and reduce their costs. So there's several steps that we think would need to be taken to achieve that. The first is grandfathering existing distributed generation systems. If systems have already been implemented under a net metering structure, certainly they should continue under that structure. But the second would be determining a total authorized utility spend for all distributed generation tariffs, rather than imposing like a megawatt cap that some states have on distributed resources. We think it's a better approach to set a total spend limit so that as costs of resources come down, we can actually do more. After that, we would suggest designating consumer categories within the spending cap. This is similar to what we have in our LREC-ZREC structure, so that you could run auctions, for instance, for different technology sizes, but also have a separate spending group for residential customers. We would then, again, suggest holding semi-annual competitive auctions for low and zero emission tariff categories, following on the 6 or 7 years now that we've had of LREC-ZREC that we know have been successful. We also think this new structure, again, a structure that has a total spend cap, but with these different auction categories, that would be an easy structure in which to integrate a statewide shared clean energy program or shared solar program. But we think that goes hand in hand with continuing to enhance the transparency of voluntary renewable energy products. Our larger goal here, again, is to give all consumers a broad variety of choices that are cost effective. And then finally, we know residential solar may not be as well suited to an auction type structure. So we would recommend, again, similar to what other states have done, to have PURA establish a compensation rate for residential solar. So this is probably of the recommendations. There's a lot of subtleties here, a lot of bigger changes. So I can imagine there would be questions on this, but we'll pause there if there's any specific questions on that before we continue with grid reliability and resiliency.
So we do have one question to start with. How do you expect the distributed generation expansion recommendation will impact its growth? Lauren, you want to answer that one?
Sure. So when we ran our numbers, our calculations in the comprehensive energy strategy, we looked at a few different scenarios. We looked at expanding business as usual, that's assuming all of our current programs, LREC, ZREC, RCIP, SHREC, expand at their current pace. And we also looked at the cost of the technology, so like the cost of bringing these systems online, plus allowing the customer to recover their investment and earn a reasonable rate of return. And we found that the $35 million total spend cap strikes the right balance of ensuring distributed generation continues to be deployed at the same level, at the same pace of growth that we've seen on average so far, so resulting in like 100 or so megawatts per year, but it also allows the customer to recover their investment plus a reasonable rate of return. So generally, we see it continuing the same pace of growth and expanding distributed generation.
A follow-up to that is, what price range per kilowatt hour does PURA have in mind for residential solar 2-meter system? I'm actually not sure what that means at the end there, but what's the price that we're thinking PURA is heading to?
Yeah, so in the CES, we didn't make a specific recommendation on what the rate for residential customers should get. We thought that was better handled by PURA as kind of the rate-making body. But in the numbers that we use in our cost estimates, we were looking at numbers that aren't too different from the current rate that residential customers are seeing, so somewhere between the 19 and 23 cent range. But again, it's up to PURA to set the rate based on our recommendation.
I would also say one of the other approaches that we recommend is actually, in addition to the rate that's set, there could be adders for other features around the generation. So in other words, giving an additional incentive for renewables that are on a specific location on the grid, or that are paired with storage, or have other positive attributes that enhance the grid.
And is that the PURA price, is that set in stone forever, or is that revisited?
So we see it as a price that can be revisited based on changed circumstances. So for example, with the recent federal tax levies on importation of solar panels, there's also the federal tax credit that has an expiration date currently that we don't know what's going to happen with that. So we see it as a price that can be revisited and should be revisited by PURA whenever it's deemed necessary. But I would note that if a customer, say, comes online in 2018 and that's what their set price is, then they will get the price for the term, and any subsequent changes would apply to new installations.
Another question on the biomass phase down. Sorry, I'm just trying to even though it will be a byproduct of forests and waste processes, do we not see a value in supporting biomass?
So, I mean, I think this is a signal that we've been sending since the IRP in 2014 and earlier, and biomass currently accounts for over 75% of the RECs settled for Class 1 in Connecticut, and we see the value in diversifying the Class 1 purchases that we're making, and we still see a value that biomass provides, which is why we're not phasing it out completely. They can still sell 50% of their output. It's just a matter of trying to increase the diversity in our Class 1 RECs.
Great, thank you, Lauren. So we're going to move on to the next and last chapter and wrap up with questions at the very end.
Great. So just a few notes here. You know, we spoke a bit about the supply side of the electric sector, but we also know that grid reliability and resiliency is also going to be key over the next several years. We recommend supporting ISO New England in improving winter natural gas generation, fuel security, and reliability, but also to continue to support community microgrids to support statewide resiliency goals. You'll see the picture on the left is where we have both operational, approved, under review, and pending microgrid projects. In strategic, we'd like to see more coverage throughout the state, but we know microgrids have been successful in supporting our energy assurance plan. And then finally, ensuring coastal resiliency of substations and other critical grid infrastructure. And again, this is related to our flood management goals. And with that, I think we're ready to transition to transportation.
Great. So I'm going to go ahead and present the transportation chapter. So as you can see in the slide here, transportation represents about 28% of our energy consumption and represents 36% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So as a major piece of our economy-wide emissions, it's a sector that we need to address in order to hit our greenhouse gas emission targets. And this slide is a table from the Governor's Council on Climate Change, in which we've been conducting analysis of hitting a midterm target of 45% below 2001 levels by 2030, as well as the 2050 target. And as you can see, this is a demonstration of the number of ZEBs approximately that we need to get on the road by 2030 and 2050. So these are no small goals and will take a lot of effort and education and outreach and policy to achieve these types of targets. So in order to do that, what we've proposed is developing an EV roadmap that includes a review of sustainable incentive funding models for the cheaper program, and in collaboration with PURA, examines the appropriate regulatory framework for EV development in Connecticut. We are just beginning to embark on the EV roadmap and getting that process going. So please stay tuned if you're interested in participating in that. We will notice that and invite stakeholders to play a role in providing input and direction. We also, as I mentioned, need to focus on increased EV uptake through consumer education and looking at new fleet purchasing models. So continuing to provide people the opportunity to experience driving an electric vehicle. First-hand experience has proven to increase adoption of a new technology like this. Fleet purchasing models such as Solarize, looking at joint or group purchasing is one way to increase purchases of electric vehicles and bring down the initial costs. And then facilitate state and regional planning that improves system efficiency and reduces vehicle miles traveled. Clearly, Connecticut doesn't have walls around it, and we work within a regional transportation system. So working with our sister states that surround us or are in the region is a very important strategy for the state to move the whole region toward a cleaner, low-carbon transportation system. That includes participating in the Transportation Climate Initiative and other regional networks that look at transportation and try to plan for the future. And I'll just close the presentation by briefly talking about modernizing the grid. This is an area that impacts all three chapters and is essential for achieving the goals that we've set forth in both the CES as well as the our Global Warming Solutions Act. So we're beginning to initiate grid modernization proceedings. PURA has a general docket currently, and will be focusing specifically on grid modernization, integrating efficiency, storage, and renewables to manage peak demand. Much of the cost of our electricity comes from peak demand, so developing strategies and utilizing grid modernization strategies to reduce that peak demand is essential. Ensure interoperability of demand response communications between buildings and the grid, so being able to use demand resources through having smart meters will be essential. Applying best practices from Federal Grid Modernization Lab Initiative as a way to move forward. So in terms of our legislative priorities, we have a few, and actually I will say that a few of the folks in the room have left to go to the Legislative Office Building. We are testifying at the Energy and Technology Committee today, talking about these specific legislative priorities at 1 p.m. So if you are interested in partaking in that, I encourage you to either head over to the LOB or tune in online. So a major piece of legislation is our 45% GHG reduction by 2030. We are proposing that go in statute into the Global Warming Solutions Act. The 40% Class 1 renewable portfolio standard by 2030. Using science-based climate resiliency planning, so using data that comes out of CIRCA to plan forward on potential flooding and the impacts of climate change into the future. Cost-effective distributed generation programs. You know, we really understand the importance of distributed generation and want to encourage its growth, but we want to do so in a cost-effective way. So Lauren and Mary talked a little bit about the net metering reform, and then commitment to energy efficiency and the Connecticut Green Bank. So proposals to secure energy efficiency moving forward and developing sustainable strategies for procuring energy efficiency. And of course, helping to make the Green Bank financially solid. So with that, I think that's the end of the presentation. I do see a few questions have come in, and I can take those. If you have additional questions, go ahead and send them in. If we don't get to all of them, then we can answer them either via email or give us a call. We're fairly accessible. So can you expand on the health and safety aspects of residential efficiency planning? Julia is here to answer that question.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. We are focusing on this more and more. The utilities have been tracking through the Home Energy Solutions Program the level of various barriers that they encounter when trying to perform home energy assessments. And it's very common, especially as many of our homes have been built before 1970, so there were obviously very different building codes, and a lot of these things like asbestos, knob and tube wiring, mold issues, pests, those can prevent a lot of energy efficiency measures going forward. These remediation costs can be very high and often are not addressed during energy efficiency upgrades. So with the Green Bank, the Department of Health, several other organizations, we are working on developing a Healthy Homes initiative to make sure that we provide funding, sustainable funding, and financial resources to people that need to do this so that we can ensure that we do achieve our 80% weatherization goals, in addition to providing these services to as many homes in Connecticut as possible, regardless of their income class. So this is something that we are working on continuously, but it is a relatively big, complex issue. So we're working with a lot of different players to integrate this as a statewide initiative.
Great, thanks, Julia. And again, that's not a formal part of our recommendation in the CES. I think that there's actually proposed legislation that is being considered by legislators, but is not a formal part of our comprehensive energy strategy. We have a few questions about microgrids. I have to admit, I am not the expert on microgrids. Veronica Sharakowski is, so I've asked her to respond to a couple specific questions. So does planning stage, there was a map of the microgrids earlier, so the person who asked about whether or not Groton is being awarded. The map was from the draft CES. The Groton project was in planning, and the project came in round 4 and is under review. So just wanted to note that. And then there's a question regarding if there will be a round 5 of microgrid grants. We're going to complete round 4 before we move on to a round 5. So I will just leave it at that unless Veronica has additional information. And I do encourage you to, like I said, to reach out directly to us here in ADEEP, either by email or by phone, and we can answer questions more directly. So unless there are additional questions, I'll give it a second for more to come in, but I will say thank you for participating. I think this has hopefully been an informative presentation of our comprehensive energy strategy. We are currently rolling out much of the recommendations in the CES and look forward to partnering with many of you to make it successful over the next few years. I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to go ahead and end it and just let you know that we are currently working to get more webinars on the schedule. We're looking to schedule something with the City of New Haven, who has released their sustainability plan sometime in April, early April. We will likely have that webinar. So please stay tuned. And again, thank you and have a great afternoon.